So, Uncle Frank takes place in the 1970s in South Carolina and New York. Now, growing up in South Carolina is Beth, played by Sophie Lillis, and she narrates most of the film, and she tells us all about how she came to know Uncle Frank, played by Paul Bettany. Uncle Frank lives in New York City, and Beth plans to go there for college. So she's excited to get to know Uncle Frank a little bit more. Every time Uncle Frank comes home, it always feels like like their father, played by Stephen Root, doesn't really like Frank. You kind of get the vibe. First off, that because Frank took off to the city, that he just ended up becoming a city boy and ended up leaving the South behind. But there's actually more to it than that. But the important thing is that Beth feels that she can trust Frank. Like, Frank speaks with Beth in private and speaks pretty openly. Like, he knows a lot more of the family secrets. He's more honest with her than most in the family are. Like, Beth really wants to talk about erotica at some points that the other girls were reading, but they don't want to let her in on it. And Frank's just kind of like, you know what? I'll talk with you about anything. And hey, you know what? If you want birth control, if you want to keep it on the down low, I'm here for you. I'm a fighter. You can trust me. So, when Beth finally comes to New York, she gets to know Frank a little bit more, and she comes to understand that Frank is actually gay and lives with his lover Wally, who's played by and I know I'm going to mispronounce this name, Peter McDissy. So Middle Eastern man who fled the Middle East because of the lethal laws against gay people, and you can kind of understand why Frank didn't tell the family and actually actively tried to hide it from the family. Like, there are a few times when Frank would invite the family over and he would pose this one woman as a girlfriend. And you can understand why, because, like, at one point, the fake girlfriend that Frank has tests the waters and says that, I'm Jewish, and Frank was afraid to tell you. And, of course, he has good reason to be afraid, because his Frank's brother, played by Steve Zahn, remarks, well, at least you're not black. So you can imagine how having a Middle Eastern man as your lover would probably not gel well with the family. So he keeps that off to the side. But feels like he can tell Beth and be open about it. And it's interesting because when Frank is in New York, he feels like he's very much in his element. He can talk openly about anything, especially with Beth. He can be himself. He can be more jovial, and also more brave. Like, there's a one point where he's confronted by a student who basically tries to entice him into sex, and Frank's like, nah, I've been around the block, kid. I'm an older gentleman. I'm not intimidated by you. So Frank is very much in his element in New York, but he has to end up coming back. He ends up coming back to South Carolina when he finds out that his father has died. And so it's going to be like a somber return home. He offers to drive Beth as well. But he doesn't want to bring Wally. Now, Wally, though, because Wally's such an eccentric and he always wants to be there for Frank, ends up following him, and basically he has to hide out in the motel while Frank goes to the funeral. And the closer they get to South Carolina, the more Frank starts to uncover more of his darker past that he's had with his father, which goes just beyond going off to the city, and even goes beyond just the reveal that he was gay, which apparently his father did find out at a fairly young age. So there's a lot of dark history that gets unearthed, and at the same time, just this this trying to find this level of acceptance of who you are. Like, for instance, Beth, who narrates most of the film, just kind of like as an observer, she actually shows a little bit more of her dominance as well. Like, at one point they go to a auto repair shop, and she's flirted on by this one guy who comes on too strong, and basically Beth talks her down and ends up really impressing Frank. Also, Wally also tries to come to terms with himself. Like, he calls home at one point, which is just very tragic, because he's still lying to his family over in the Middle East, saying, yeah, someday I'll marry a woman, and it'll happen. Don't worry, Mom. It's fine. but then there comes like a very tragic moment in the third act where Frank will have to be very open about himself and reveal himself, lest he slip back into his alcoholic addiction, which becomes a very troubling element. Like, there's a lot to love about this film. First off, the cast is amazing. You have Paul Bettany putting on like a pretty immersive performance. Like, usually, like, I get a little bit annoyed when some actors try to like put on more of like an American accent, but he actually does really well here. Sophie Lillis does a great job as kind of the wide-eyed observer trying to understand the ways of the world in the 70s. I also like that there's a lot more to her character and that she's really, really into literature and feels like she's an outsider. Like when she comes back home, she talks a lot about, how like, have you heard about Capote? And everyone's like, who? She's like, I met someone from the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I'm like, oh yeah, I watched that show. So she kind of feels like an outsider. Peter McDisey has a really great performance too. Like he's perfect as an eccentric, but also is incredibly emotional. Like when he watches Frank deteriorate and just can't stand to watch him like that, but also wants to desperately be by his side. Steve Zahn, I was actually surprised. Like, it's been a while. Like, when was the last time you saw Steve Zahn in a film? And he actually does really well as Frank's mustachioed brother, who wants to be there for him. Like, he's still got some of those, like, ignorant Southern roots. But you can tell that he deeply loves Frank throughout the film, especially when they get to the funeral. You have Judy Greer putting on a great performance as, someone who feels like she's doing all the right things, but feels that life has kind of wronged her. You have Margot Martindale as Frank's absolutely adoring mother. Like, it seems like she's constantly in the kitchen trying to cook stuff up, but also trying to understand her children and be there for them. And just, she's the sweetest mom. Stephen Root perfectly embodies that kind of like Southern dad who's not quite understanding. And then you have Lois Smith, who does a really great job as the aunt here, kind of like the aunt with the glasses that kind of like look like they have like pointy edges that come out. She's got the big white hair. And she just keeps talking and talking and talking. And I think a lot of people know a family member like this, someone who has a lot of experience and just wants to share all of it with you. Even if it's pretty ignorant. Like at one point, she's talking about gay people oh, I've known gay people, they're fine, but they're going to hell, and like, I'm sorry I put the Midwest accent on there. I know she's Southern, but whatever. So there's some pretty great drama in here. I like that Paul Bettany goes through a wealth of emotions in this. When you see him in New York City, he's very cocky. He's got a perfect smile. He's always eccentric and happy. And then when he comes home and has a tragic reveal kind of unearthed, and the whole family realizes what happened in the past, he is just a mess. Like you see his face distort, just like he's sweating, like he's twitching, like he can't bear to live with himself with what happened in his past. And once they reveal, okay, because it's more than just his dad finding out he was gay. Like it has to do with a younger man who he used to love, and how that really came to like deeply traumatize him for the rest of his life. That you could understand why he'd be very reluctant about coming home and why he retreats into booze the further that he gets back to his father, because his father is someone he doesn't want to face. And by the end of the film, I was surprised. By the end of the film, there's a level of acceptance that comes over the film, but it's also not an easy acceptance. Like when most of the family, like this is a little bit of a spoiler, but by the end of the film, Frank reveals that he is gay, and the family has very, very mixed reactions that are kind of relatable. So like you have like the mother who's just like, look, you're my son, and I will love you no matter what, and I still love you, and I want to meet your boyfriend. I want to meet who's going to be in our family. You have some family members who just can't bear to look at Frank. Like there's one family member who just can't look him in the eye and can't bear the fact that he's gay, so he's just gonna stew off in the corner. And then you have like I mentioned, Lois Smith playing the aunt who will try to seem like she's understanding, but she also really, really doesn't like gay people. So you kind of have a mixed reaction, but a surprising level of acceptance that I think Frank wasn't fully counting on. And also like Steve Zahn is just I'm sorry to keep coming back to Steve Zahn. Just it's been a while since I've seen him in a film, and he's so good here. That's just a great performance, just all around. You have an amazing cast here, and most of them just give these great performances of layered characters in the 1970s, where they're not quite sure how to shift with the evolving of the culture, and and whether or not to be accepting of gay people. It seems like it's a little bit fantastical towards the end, but like I said, because of that mixed bag reaction towards the end, I think it feels like a little bit more relatable. Now this film, it released on Amazon Prime on Thanksgiving, and couldn't be more fitting. That whole like coming home and trying to awkwardly maneuver around family members you think might not be accepting, and then finding acceptance. It seems like a lot to swallow for coming out as gay in 1970s South Carolina. And yet it works its charm enough that where I think even if it is more like wish fulfillment, I think like it works well enough that it gets the happy ending that you kind of want, and that I feel like the film kind of deserves by the end. So it's great drama. Does it get a little bit soapy and sentimental? A little bit here and there. But I think what really makes the film come together, and what really made me love it so much, was just the fine performances by Bettany, by Lilith, by Lillis, and even by McDeesey for as much as he tries to like protrude into this film as much as he can. He makes great use of his scenes, and just everyone in general. Lois Smith, Margot Martindale, Judy Greer, Steve Zahn, Stephen Root, everyone does a fine performance in this film, that it makes you want to believe that you could come home and come out and still have a family that loves you. So heartwarming, maybe a tad bit artificial, but you know what? That's fine. For a film that's aiming for that level of drama and comedy, I think it mostly works, and it's amped up just by these fine performances. So for Uncle Frank, 4 out of 5 stars.